My name is Haley Benson. I've compiled this overview presentation on housing mobility and its relationship with subsidized housing. The focus of my report was considering the potential for positive impact in bringing housing mobility to low-income subsidized housing households. I chose this topic of affordable housing and subsidized housing because it's a really important one. Affordable housing is an initiative that often faces critique and calls for reassessment and even defunding. So I think it's an initiative that needs to continuously be engaged with in discourse and continue to be improved and protected with policy. I'll give a brief overview of what subsidized housing is. Subsidized housing is housing and rent assistance for low-income to very low-income households subsidized by the government. So low-income households who are accepted into a program pay 30 to 40% of their adjusted income for rent, and the government agrees to make up the rest. There are three major types of subsidized housing, and it's been found that tenant-based subsidized housing, the third one here, is more closely related to housing mobility and increases the opportunity for housing mobility. But public housing, the first one here, which is what people typically think of when they think of subsidized housing, is government owned and the rental process is handled through a government agency. Project-based subsidized housing, the middle type, is a little different in that it's privately owned buildings and units. And the important thing to note with project-based subsidized housing is that property managers and owners get to decide whether or not they'll rent to subsidized housing households, and they get to decide which units they'll rent to subsidized housing households. Tenant-based subsidized housing, the third type here, opens up opportunity in terms of where renters can decide to apply and rent, because in theory, tenant-based renters can apply to any privately owned housing that rents at or below a fair market rate. So tenant-based housing really gives tenants and renters more access to choice in terms of what neighborhoods and what units they decide to rent. We'll move on to defining housing mobility. Housing mobility in relation to subsidized housing specifically means a household having the resources and opportunity to improve housing situation through relocation, and it includes not being restricted to renting in economically distressed or high poverty areas, which is something that does often happen when you are renting at such a low rate and when your rent is subsidized. The Housing Choice Voucher Program, which is the tenant-based type of subsidized housing, the third type mentioned 2 slides ago, began in 1974 and has quickly become the most commonly used form of housing assistance. The pie chart here shows government spending on assisted housing in 2015, and it shows that distributing housing choice vouchers was the most funded type of subsidized housing. And as was discussed, the voucher program increases opportunity for housing mobility compared to other types of housing, subsidized housing. So the housing mobility movement, which involves activists and nonprofits and policymakers, really means just doing what is necessary to secure these low-income subsidized households the right to access safe and quality housing, which is a right that it has been demonstrated that they do not currently have. There have been a number of housing mobility initiatives, and two major ones that are cited often in housing studies is the MTO program and the GATRO Assisted Housing Program. The major thing that was found with these studies is that when given the opportunity, subsidized housing households did want to and choose to move to less economically distressed areas. And the MTO program and its corresponding study found specifically that it can be demonstrated that moving to a less economically distressed area can improve quality of life for households and their members. Mobility and education is a link that is often looked at in these housing studies, and while many of them have not been able to gather data that supports a direct causal relationship between educational performance and housing mobility, it has been found that a better neighborhood means increased access to better funded schools. A better neighborhood means potentially an improved environment, which means less environmental stressors, and environmental stressors can have a negative impact on children's educational performance. And it's also been found that when low-income students attend school alongside middle to high-income students, there is the opportunity for increased educational performance. Mobility and mental health is another link that is looked at often in housing studies. And it has been found that spatial factors and neighborhood conditions do affect mental health. One study in particular found that participants who moved from high poverty to low poverty areas did see an increase in positive mental health. This is data from that particular study. The light blue is participants who moved to lower poverty areas, and the dark blue is participants who stayed in their initial neighborhoods in high poverty areas. And so the participants who moved saw less instances of a major depressive episode and reported less feelings of anxiety. This is more data from this particular study. The participants who did move to lower poverty areas reported more feelings of peacefulness and reported more normal sleeping patterns than the participants who remained in their initial high poverty neighborhoods. The takeaway here, I think, is that housing mobility is something that needs to be continued to be worked on. We need to continue to work to give low-income subsidized housing households more access to choice. It's important because it's not giving someone something, it is more of a restorative process. Struggling to afford housing is a burden that is placed upon people by forces that are often out of their control. And so those who do have the resources to affect these forces are responsible for addressing this disparity.